Well, I think we should begin. And I want to just honor this spacious hour that we have together and share our breath together as we get to converse about an interesting topic. I am not sure if in the history of ADEC other psychedelics have been talked about in sessions, because this is my first time, but I feel so honored to be here and get to introduce this. And as you can see, I love planting seeds, so take as many of the flower packets home as you want. My name is Ken Breniman. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, yoga therapist, and I'm also a plant medicine integration counselor. There's not really a certification for that, so we kind of have to make up names these days, but I go by the pronouns he, him, or when we're talking about a collective experience, we, us. And I specialize in helping my clients find some way of making peace with unresolved questions and try to cultivate equanimity around loss. And as my title says, the seeds that we'll be planting today, a little bit of those sunflower seeds there you've got, but they're also the seeds of pondering some questions. And my hope is by participating in this collaborative learning experience, you're gonna gain an increased comfort level with a new topic, or 70% of people that answered my poll had little or no experience about ayahuasca or psychedelic-assisted therapy. And also just an introductory knowledge base, because my hunch is over the years, we'll see more of this topic showing up in our field. So I'm calling this a tiny little sprout in the field of thanatology. And my hope would be that this plant medicine that we talk about today, ayahuasca, just gives us one sense of potentiality and reviewing some of the risks of people that would use ayahuasca. Personally, ayahuasca helped me get unstuck with grief many years ago, well over a decade. And I do have a particular calling to share what I know about it and some of the cases that I've worked with as a therapist along the way. Note, it's in the fine print, but this is for informational purposes only. No legal or medical advice here, right? So, with any presentation, my hope is that there'll be some new information, there'll be some information we're familiar about, there might be some information that's solidly rooted in evidence-based, but there'll also be some anecdotal and opinions expressed here. Most of all, I hope we can kind of toil and tend to the soil here so that when we have a chance to talk about this at the end, we'll just have more information to have interesting conversations. Now, yesterday in Dr. Kosminski's heart-to-heart presentation, was anyone there? Did anyone go to that? She said two things that really enlivened me. One was the value of each of our opinions in this field, but also this powerful cycle where theory helps practice, and of course practice helps theory. And it's kind of maybe a chicken or the egg or a plant or a seed question, which came first? And does anyone know which came first, a plant or a seed? Actually, a plant did, right? So earlier plants didn't have seeds. So there is a scientific answer to that. And ultimately, we're just here to gather to refine our questions and sort of live like Rilke wanted us to live into the future where we might be ready for different answers. So those seed packets, does everyone have one? I'm gonna ask if you will be willing to kind of hold maybe the sides of them, and between the two bowl rings, oops, that wasn't one of them, I'd like to know if you might just add a little shake or rattle, so it might sound something like this. That's it. Okay, so that's it, excellent. So I'm going to ask you to multitask in this meditation, right? So it's a meditative metaphor, and if you've got your seed packet and you're willing to shake it along the way, feel free to close your eyes or even just softly look down at the floor. If you don't like closing your eyes, you can actually watch your hand shaking the seed packet. Ready? And I'll ring this once, rattle them until you hear the bowl again. So, and if your arms get tired, you can stop too. So I'd like you to imagine that you're at home and you are about to be visited by a very respected, loving teacher. Now, this teacher is going to arrive, and you can do anything and everything to clean up your home and get ready for the teacher's arrival. Now, you sit there and you wait for the teacher to arrive, and you know deep in your heart, there's that place where you stuffed laundry underneath the desk, or you've got maybe some spoiling food in the refrigerator, or you forgot to scrub a toilet, or your hair feels maybe messed up. And you sit there and you feel really ready, except for that one little thought. The teacher arrives, walks in, offers you a huge hug filled with care and compassion. You feel seen, supported. Now next, the teacher takes you by the hand, lovingly guides you to that one unkempt place and says firmly and with utmost kindness, let's start here. How might you feel? What might you want to share? What questions might you have for this teacher? You know that this teacher only wants you to feel free from shame and suffering, wishes you to feel contentment. Now, as we share a deep breath, and just notice what might be showing up in your heart, your mind, your body. If you are taking notes, you might just jot that down. This is a meditative metaphor that was gifted to me 12 years ago when I first was preparing to sit with ayahuasca. A Mayan indigenous elder once said, "We simply want peace for humanity." The lesson we want to share with the world doesn't come from books. It comes from our wisdom, knowledge, experience, and spirituality. So as we move through this hour together, let's just hold this meditative metaphor and the saying by the Mayan elder and see how it might pertain to helping people who are self-determined and self-identify as being stuck in grief and might want some support in moving through that grief. Here's our seeds. So we're here merely to explore these three questions. That's a big task in 1 hour, but every session I've seen, they've taken on pretty big tasks. And what I find most intriguing, and these are words by Ernest Hemingway, is that I believe that spirituality and evidence-based research have something really in common, and that's this. It's good to have an end to journey toward, but it's the journey that matters in the end. So we're going to tackle each of these. I'm going to give you a little bit of preparation for each of the questions as we go through. The first question, dive right in, is what is ayahuasca? Before coming to today's, has anyone not heard of the word? Yeah, right? And it kind of floats around. Lisa Ling, let's see. There's lots of pop stars out there that will say they've sat with ayahuasca. And traditionally, Western anthropologists can't really track how it all began, but it was a psychedelic tea that was brewed by Amazonian indigenous healers in a variety of places along the Amazon. And some of the most interesting origin stories try to wrap our Western minds around how could these two plants that grow in different parts of the rainforest, how could they be found without any scientific ability, brew them together for 10 days, and then offer this tea that was used for healing purposes. So the woody piece there is actually vines that can grow about this big, and they climb up trees. They pull the trees down over, say, 40, 50 years and clear the space so the rainforest has more things to grow, right? And that vine has harmaline and other alkaloids that are natural antidepressants, also cleanse the stomach, and they hold our body's ability to keep the DMT that comes through the blood-brain barrier. Just a brief introduction. And then the green are these leaves from a plant that's related to the coffee plant called a trichruna leaf, and those hold DMT. Now you could chew on those plants all day long, and you'll just get a green-filled mouth. There's no psychedelic quality to them. So those plants grown alone or even together are considered legal plants. It's not until they're merged together in this cooking ceremony that they become a ta-da, a Schedule 1 illegal drug. So it's interesting that in the United States that it would be classified that because a Schedule 1 drug by definition, that there's no therapeutic value, that there's no currently accepted medical use, and there's also a high potential for abuse. Now, of course, further research is needed to look into all of those, but there's been some legal, I guess, ambiguity around this because in 1993, two churches here in the United States that are originally from Brazil, they fought to have ayahuasca served as a legal sacrament in their services. So these plants are grown in various places where tropical plants can grow, and that's mainly to honor that Westerners using these plants are they may go to the Amazon for healing, but if they're going to grow them on their own, that it's not to harm the ecosystem in the Amazon. And when we look at, and I love the poll results. I don't know how to open those up, but I'll figure that out by the end of the day. But most people that I asked what they thought of the war on drugs named that it was unjust, or it was ill-conceived, or it does a lot of harm to communities, especially African-American communities. And what it also holds us back from is a lot of research that's been on hold ever since the 50s. And so it's about this balance of walking mindfully into looking at this as a modality of healing here in the West. Another interesting legal factoid is that there are places like Oregon that have decriminalized psilocybin, places like Oakland, where I'm from, that have decriminalized almost all plant medicines. And that's really just to recognize that people have self-autonomy to be able to grow or treat themselves with these medicines if they feel called to do so. I want to plant the seed of cultural consideration and sacred reciprocity. And the seeds of the questions that I ponder with this is, how do we move forward in a world where we've acknowledged the harm colonization has done to indigenous communities? And if indeed the Pachamama Alliance and people that have cultivated this plant medicine are saying to the West, this is a gift, how does the West integrate ayahuasca into the healthcare system with reverence and giving back to the communities that have offered this? Well, just hopefully, and earlier in the groups, I sat in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice training, and that session was really powerful too, because it's how do we step with humility and grace into the ways of respecting others and still doing our own work. Hold on. I know everyone who's been in a session this week that had something to do with prolonged grief disorder. Who'd love to revisit that rabbit hole briefly? Anyone? All right. So I was very excited to put that into the title just for the sake of saying that is not the only way to look at grief. And we are in this time where science really can't keep up with the reality of how we're grieving. And I just want to name one particular model that guides me in the work that I do, and that's Francis Weller's 5 Gates model. And that 5 Gates it's inviting each of us to recognize where we hold grief and to circle up, recreate communities, and even villages that know how to hold this grief. So it's borrowing from our past so that we can move forward into the future. And very simply stated, those 5 gates are one is everything we love we will lose. The second is there are places within us that have not known love. There's also the sorrows of the world, or planetary grief. And 4 is living in our lives, what is it we expected and did not receive? And the 5th, ancestral grief. So before we kind of use prolonged grief as terminology in a case study, I really want to acknowledge that that's not the framework that I think ayahuasca needs or wants us to hold. And the one statement that got me through my half-masters in thanatology was, not everything we count counts, and not everything that counts can be counted, and holding many paradoxical and complementary energies around us as grief workers. My other thanatological, I guess, superhero is Stephen Jenkinson from Canada. Does anyone know his work as grief walker? And I'd just like to share one of his insights, and he calls grief our sacred midwife. And the midwife is to build capacity so that we're able to be immensely grateful for being born. Now, we might even argue that science, as we get into prolonged grief, is reductionistic and is unable to fully capture the humanistic and holistic qualities of grief. And what I loved about Dr. Brooke Grease's presentation was that we're going to do our best with the toolbox we have, but we're also going to do our best to improve upon that toolbox. And isn't this quite an interesting time to be called to do this work? It's almost like, I think of the movie Awakenings, where people are awake for brief periods of time and they fall back asleep. I feel like in our culture, each of us who are awakened to this work are here to remind one another, it's okay, we can do this together. And I hope that my nickname doesn't get to be Pollyanna, but I actually see a silver lining of being alive in this today's world, because look at what's happening before us. The list that I wrote and meditated on is almost too hard for me to read out loud, but we've got the pandemic. We've got a mental health crisis. We have substance abuse and overdoses skyrocketing. We've got impoverished communities and homeless encampments. There's a tragic international war unfolding before our eyes. As dreadful as all of that sounds, it might be that we're actually in the midst of a paradigm shift that's working towards rebalancing. And if anything inspired me to believe that was to spend this week with you all. You ready? Who wants to deal with prolong? I want to prolong this just a little bit more, right? Oh, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I would like to know, and you can raise your hands as many times as you want, how many people think having prolonged grief as a construct in our work is helpful in any way, shape, or form? You see a smattering for those listening to the pre-recorded, a smattering of hands, just about 3 or 4. How many people feel that it's harmful? And how many are going to raise both hands and say it's probably a mixed bag? You got them all. Yeah. I think as important as it is to recognize that it might be something in our toolbox that we're using now, that it's one way to help some people access support. I personally grew up in a time where that wasn't prolonged grief wasn't a phrase that was used, but years later when I heard it, I was like, someone does understand. However, it's unfortunate that it's in the DSM. But look at it this way. Another paradigm shift is if grief is going to enter into the world of psychiatry, and we know how important it is to be of service around grief, and if ayahuasca is going to enter into the medical world and its psychedelic qualities really can't be altered, what might shift over the upcoming years? Most importantly in the slide, I want to just acknowledge that there are many rhymes and reasons of the risk factors of why people get stuck. And in the case study, you'll see some of these show up, but our attachment style, our relationship to the deceased, the nature of our loss, and what kind of support we might receive, and the degree in which we've grieved past losses. And these deep-seated, unacknowledged, ambivalent mixed feelings about the death or the person. And social, economic, and personal circumstances also play a part. And aren't we just living this forward and trying to understand it backwards? Now, our individual and collective understanding of grief will continue to evolve. And just sitting here with you all, mixing and mingling and contemplating is bringing me so many new ideas and inspirations to take back with me. Now, I was here in St. Louis in 1999 going to social work school at Washington University. And there I was handed, I've heard a couple of these types of situations with my colleagues here, but handed a slip. These are the stages of grief, study these, we'll talk about them next week. And really it wasn't even a full course. It was just a counseling wink at grief exists. I was lucky to do some intern practicum around grief at the medical center, but still we were working on the knowledge base we had then. Fast forward for me in 2016 when I went to Marian University, that's when I was introduced to the two different dual track models. And these Kermit the Frog colored green in there, how many people are familiar with one or two of the dual tracks? Yes. I'd like you to hold those two circles, one in which there's grief work, and then there's what I call grief restoration, and how the importance is almost the oscillation or stitching our parts back together. And if we can hold that duality, just like the ADEC symbol and the yin and yang, we might just see that this very much resembles what an ayahuasca journey is like. And I loved in the literature about how people would say that it's important for adaptive coping in grief that the dosage of grieving is important. We can be overwhelmed by so much or get the right amount of support or time in either of these realms. It might be important, considering in the poll that I set up, that over 70% of the people that answered in the ADEC community said that they had no or little experience of psychedelic-assisted therapy. So I thought it would be important for us just to try to find some common language around what a psychedelic experience is. It's easier for lay people. It's harder for researchers that try to measure what a non-ordinary mind state or a psychedelic experience or a mystical experience might be. I've attended many UCSF conferences where they sit there and like, how can we measure what's going on there? And I just have, my heart is so open to the researchers willing to keep moving that field of knowledge forward. So literally stated, a psychedelic experience is defined as mind revealing. And that would make sense that we Westerners would stick with the mind, but there's so much else going on. The healing components of the medicine, like I said, it works on the digestive system, which we're knowing our gut is also part of our, it's our second brain. But there's many big shifts that happen in who we see ourselves, how we relate to the world. And one common look at it is it's kind of like having a very vivid dream. Or having a religious experience. So what's really important about finding common language is also really helpful in the integration process, because people might be talking about an experience, trying to make sense of it, and finding ways to let them, what I call adult baby talk, have ways to bring their experience into the world by writing or journaling or painting or dancing. But there is this way in which we look at these medicines or hallucinogens or even entheogens that are going to be important for us to keep refining what the language is around that. Luckily, we thanatologists have another body of knowledge that has a little more information available to us about a non-ordinary mind state. Does anyone want to guess what that might be? What other? Haven't seen many sessions talking about it. Not that I've got to every one, but I'm going to give a shout. What? A near-death experience. So there's been research going on, I think as early as maybe the 60s I could track back, and the more recent knowledge base was finding that these 8 universally common elements of a near-death experience. Now, what that means is if someone has an unexpected experience, they consider it near death, it doesn't mean that they have all of these, but they may have one or more. Likewise, no matter what culture you would go to, there are similarities to be found. I think the most important part here is to notice that the reluctance to return to life was a common element that would show up. Not for everybody, but for some people that had a near-death experience. And if you were to give these themes of going through a tunnel or having a life review or how time and space might shift, one can imagine how difficult it might be to integrate that when they come back into their body and their everyday life. So very small samples, but Shannon Lister looked at what it's like, and the acronym there is near-death experience and ayahuasca-induced experience is what the researchers are calling it. What they found was in both of their samples to compare was that they had very much those 8 common phenomena showing up. So it could be that they had this heightened sense, that they met someone that they know or don't know, but it felt like they were guiding them, that there were these visions and this sense of feeling interconnected. Their intuition or their kind of understanding of the world really expanded, and they had a deeper understanding of who they were as a person in all of that bigness. Now, fear is definitely not something you'd want to amplify, but a lot of people experience intense fear along with ecstasy, peace, and love. And this main difference that these small samples of research found was that the ayahuasca users were able to step back in more often than not with a willingness to integrate their newly acquired insights. Let's see. Nice. So how might ayahuasca compare to other modalities that are used to help people that are stuck in grief? And what's interesting is that ayahuasca looks a little bit like intense psychotherapy. I hear a lot of people try to measure how many years of therapy I did in that one ceremony. And it is definitely an exposure therapy that people would want to be prepared to be unprepared for. The words secure regression, when I think of that, I think of the way that the plant medicine might hug you or take your hand and say, let's start here. And can there be a sense of support in lowering your ego defenses so you can address something that feels unfinished in life? Creative divergent thinking. Has anyone seen the new Michelle Yeoh, Jamie Lee Curtis movie yet? No? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I highly recommend it if you want everything, everywhere, all at once. It's trippy. It's a very intense but heartful love story. And you get to see Michelle Yeoh do a lot of creative divergent thinking in it. And it also helps one kind of lower the judgmental processing and reactivity to things so that you can kind of soak in perhaps that new information or new insight. The other Hollywood rendition of, I think, a psychedelic journey that the next time you watch Christmas Carol, imagine Ebenezer Scrooge drinks a tea, lays back, and then is visited by his 3 ghosts. Right? And there's a lot of him coping with loss in that as well. So when I thought of it's going to really be a long time before we're all walking around saying psychedelic-assisted grief therapy. Maybe a very long time before we're all talking about that. When I thought about the ways that anyone that's interested in this might have some considerations. The first is just honoring where we are in our own comfort level with the topic. I mean, you're sitting here, and no one's walked out yet, so that's a start. And it's also just to know that our scope of practice and where we are as far as if someone came to you and said, I really want to work on a post journey, or whether you're comfortable or not, is important to acknowledge. There is a really succinct 90-page book called After the Ceremony Ends, and that hones in, it's by another psychologist, but it hones in on the importance of preparation and aftercare and integration. And the two frameworks that work really well with psychedelic support is understanding more about a person's near-death experience and the protocol around leading with empathy, compassion, and non-judgmentalness, and always seeking consultation. I'm blessed to have an elder psychologist who worked in the first wave of psychedelics and back with the Timothy Learys and Ram Dass's, and so being able to be supported by someone that has walked this path for a long time feels very empowering to be able to talk about this work. And the other frame is transpersonal psychology. And my definition of that is you see the person and you see that they're just not the person. There's much more to them. So this psycho-spiritual framework can help. I've also included probably way too many resources at the end of the slideshow, but there are growing numbers of psychedelic-assisted therapy trainings. And that's not that it's going to give you a certification to go out and do this work, but it's going to give a more solid knowledge base so people can feel comfortable with it as the field evolves. And advocacy, there are more and more groups that are decriminalizing plant medicines. If that intrigues you, it's simply called Decriminalize Nature, and they have a website. They're spreading throughout the country, and it's just one way to look at the war on drugs. So I would like to make sure I have time. Good. Whew. I timed myself, and I was like, okay, if I can get through that part in 30 minutes, I really want to spend the next 12 minutes or so with a client who's given my blessing to, of course, change a lot of the information, but to share a little bit about her experience, and then have time for question and answers. So I'd like you to be introduced to Sue, who's a 39-year-old. She's married, heterosexual, cisgendered female, and she identifies as biracial. Her grandparents were Latino and Italian. And she's married for 4 years and has no kids. She lives near her mom. She reports that the mother and her are close. Something throughout the work shows up differently about that. She went to Unitarian Church until her mid-20s, and at the time, this was back in 2018, identified as a non-church-going Christian. Her father died when he was 62 after about 6 months of pancreatic cancer, and he died in the hospital. They didn't get to bring him home in time. And Sue reported that they had what she called a strained and estranged relationship as an adult, that due to his lack of caring and what she called cold parenting, he always seemed disinterested in her as a child, and she could never figure out why. There was this, when her dad died, Sue reported feeling this increased longing. It was very much the classic definitions that is in the prolonged grief disorder description, but she really wanted her dad to be alive, and deep growing regrets that she didn't do enough to bring some kind of cohesion to the relationship while he was. At work and at home, she just felt less and less like herself, irritability, eating more, not able to sleep. And what really brought her into therapy was she was becoming more and more concerned that the irritability was impacting her relationship with her husband. Her goal was simply to find mitigation of these intensifying symptoms. And the support she wanted from me was, she already had planned an ayahuasca session, and she was going to travel overseas for that. But she wanted support before and after. We did agree that she met the criteria for at the time, the proposed ICD-11 prolonged grief disorder, and both a high score in her adverse childhood experiences that really reflected what Gabor Mate calls trauma by omission, and that's another movie I recommend, The Wisdom of Trauma by Gabor Mate. It's harder to find because he's streaming it intermittently, but definitely worthwhile looking at. And she also scored 26 on the Inventory of Complicated Grief screening tool. She denied past sexual abuse, was very present, somewhat flat affect, and really good insight into her presenting problem. She had a strong, like I said earlier, a strong support system, but as she prepared to get ready for the ayahuasca journey, her mom became more and more distant. We ruled out other comorbidities like depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD. I probably wouldn't have done all of that if we weren't dealing with insurance, but she also did have a history of depression and anxiety in her family, but not anything that would hinder her from doing an ayahuasca journey. And currently, people with a history of bipolar or schizophrenia or other psychiatric issues in their family are considered to hold off on doing deep psychedelic journeys, but there is some more research on bipolar disorder. She had started taking a dose of Wellbutrin 6 months ago. It was pretty low, and she was working with her providing doctor to wean from that. She had to be free from any antidepressants for about a week or so before taking ayahuasca. While she acknowledged a history of adolescent suicidal ideation, nothing current, and while we established this therapeutic alliance, we were really working on her setting an intention for her ayahuasca journey. And she had planned this pretty well, where we got to work for about a month together. She went off to the healing center that was run by a local shaman, and then there were some Western English-speaking helpers there. It was very interesting to be introduced to that healing center. Now, the one thing she said before she left, and it just stuck in my heart, is that the numbness. When I asked her to describe what that was, she said what it felt like was behind this wall of numbness was this persistent and increased sense of just she never said anger, but irritability was the best she could get to. And she said she hated herself for wanting her dad to be alive now because she hated him so much when he was alive. And the increased tension between her and her mom, and she was so glad that she was finally taking a week off because she hadn't taken much time off for bereavement. So during the week away, I made myself available. She emailed me a couple of times, but she seemed to have adequate, a really good support team where she went. When she came back, she had this to say about her 3 journeys. Now, the first journey was mostly physical discomfort and some vomiting, which isn't uncommon with ayahuasca. And the meaning-making she offered herself in that was, I wonder if this is what my father felt like when he was dying. And she was very reluctant to do the second and the third that was spaced out over the course of the week, but with some support of the helpers there at the healing center, she did do the second session. And what she experienced there was what she described as witnessing without reliving the intense emotional pain. And even though she never had a close relationship with him, she could feel what he was feeling while she was feeling what she was feeling, and she was enveloped in a mutual forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think this came about because the helpers there had coached her around a Polynesian chant. We know it through the Hawaiian Ho'oponopono, but she was guided to chant to herself, I love you, I forgive you, please forgive me, thank you. And what that helped her see was it was like watching a movie of her life, these flickering scenes where her dad was just not available, but she could hold that in a wider heart space. And she did have this one fleeting moment where she felt like she was going through some kind of alley or tunnel, and what she thought she saw was images of her dad as a child sitting all alone and abandoned and afraid. And she didn't know much about his childhood, so this was just some insight that she could hold on her own. Now, her third session, she said for the most part it felt like she was just lying in a field of love and acceptance, and there were these bright visuals, and she felt like the plants and the stars were all cheering her on. And what the message she took home with her was that love will always be there, let go of doubt. So in our integrative therapy sessions, it was was a profound difference. She came back about 4 days after her return from the journeys. And what I noticed was her ability to express her emotions more fully. Whatever was behind that numbness was able to come to the forefront. She cried more openly. I think the most touching part was that she, for the first time, had planned to visit her father's grave. We continued working for another 4 weeks after our original 12-week sessions were set up. And the biggest problem she had with integration was with her mom, that she realized that there was a pretty classic triangulation happening all her life, and she'd really turned a blind eye to that. So she eventually invited her mom, who was willing to go, to family grief support, and that was with another therapist. But I have heard back from her, and she seems to be doing well. She hasn't used any psychedelics since, but there seems to be a certain kind of rootedness that this has given her. And she's also has developed a lot of personal self-care practices that weren't present prior to the work that we did together. This case shows that that ayahuasca could play a part in her willingness to identify what she needed to work on, and what Stephen Jenkinson calls this building a grief capacity. And the journey also seemed to show a way in which the first session was definitely a lot, the first and second sessions was a lot of work, but in the third session she was able to feel restoration or care in that experience. And I do have a few other interviews that I recorded in a podcast called Breathing Wind, and it's breathingwind.com. It's the second season. And I got to interview 3 people. One person worked with mushrooms, but they were all grief-related, and how plant medicine played a part in their journeys. So I hope, if all goes well, yes, 5 minutes extra time. I wanted to move through the garden rather mindfully, but I wanted to get the information out so that we also have space and time to discuss, talk, plant seeds. And now, at the last 5 minutes, I just want to have a final wrap up. So my sense is that this mic has to travel along. How long is the leash here? Or I can repeat the questions back if necessary, but yes. And do you mind saying your name?
Sure, I'm Alexandra.
Hi, Alexandra.
And I'm not a clinician, I'm a funeral professional,
I'm Mitch.
but I am someone who has experienced psychedelic therapy myself with psilocybin and can attest to its really powerful medicine. And was just wondering if you draw from maps at all in their research, and just wanted to throw that out there as a resource for anyone else who is curious about learning more about psychedelic therapy. That's a really great one.
Yes. Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Yes.
Thank you, Alexandra. So mentioning maps is definitely, it's in the suggested readings. They also are, they're going for the low-hanging fruit, and they're very wise in doing that. They're looking at MDMA and trauma. And as we know, in dancing the dance of legalizing a medicine, we need to find what it can treat, right? So we'll probably see in the next, 3 or 5 years, legalization of MDMA. I think it's in the trial, third phase of the trials. And a lot of that is going on at UCSF. MAPS also has an extension, Zendo project. Are you familiar with them too? So Zendo, Z-E-N-D-O, and what they're known for is training people to be sitters when people are having a difficult psychedelic experience. So you will see them at Coachella or Outside Lands or big concerts where people are exploring. They're at Burning Man, places where people are going to consciously alter their minds, but they might get in a little bit too deep. And the frame that, the therapeutic or even the shamanic frame is to have someone ready for you in that so you can work through it. Is there more about MAPS that you wanted to share?
And they also research psilocybin,
Yes,
as
yes.
well as the MDMA and ketamine.
Ketamine, right.
So
Right. Which ketamine is a legalized treatment protocol for hard to treat depression, but I know once, again, it's legalized, then people may access it for other things. Thank you very much. MAPS.org. Thank you very much for that resource. What a beautiful garden of smiling faces. Yes?
So, my name's Amy,
Hi, Amy.
and I'm part of a group that's developing a psychedelic-assisted therapy clinic in Oregon. I live in Oregon. And so we are going to be submitting our application in January is the first that we can do that. I'm the end-of-life specialist because I work with people who are dying, and there is a ton of great research that's already been done, specifically with psilocybin, or at least that's what I'm most familiar with. We are looking at all of these pieces of, there's so many logistics that go into it, but as a clinician, I'm interested in your experience with any sort of challenges that come up either on the front end and doing prep work, intention setting, and then the integration side. We're actually going to be doing hopefully all of that. But yeah, I'm just curious what challenges have arisen for you and how,
Oh yeah. If I were to draw some kind of graph, I would say, like, how could I minimize the plant medicine piece of this and enhance the preparation and even make larger the integration piece? Because I think as soon as we're like, whoa, this works so well, then I think we tend to overemphasize it. And even though, as I said earlier, there's no evidence that shows that it has a high potential for abuse, I do think the concept of spiritual emergence or spiritual bypass is a really key component in understanding in any of our work with someone that wants to do this psychedelic-assisted therapy. So that after the ceremony ends would be the go-to handbook, and it is 90 pages long, but it has many questions that a client or a staff could ask themselves to see if they're ready for, and then what to have at the tail end after they've. But to go to your question, what's the most challenging? I think right now, if you ask me tomorrow, it'll probably be different, but I think right now what's coming up for me is helping people that have found prescription medicines to help them along the way, and those have become their primary form of taking care of themselves internally. Helping someone safely wean from that so that they could step into this is probably the biggest challenge. And one, because I know some people are like, I have to give up coffee for a week, but other people that have been on, say, an antidepressant for 10 years, that's not an easy thing to wean from.
Are you working with the providers on that, or is that just
Yes. So
the client is the go-between, or are you talking to them?
we often talk with the provider, and if they're going elsewhere, then no, the provider is very much in the loop, and it's got to be that village mentality where if the weaning side effects are too great, we need to really step back in and safely help someone stay with the medicines that they're accustomed to. Yeah.
Just so if anyone cares, subtlewinds.com.
Subtlewinds.com.
That's our program. We're also going to be doing training for facilitators.
Yes.
We have just a ton of education around that. We come from a background from an agency with 50 years. We've been doing rock medicine and psychedelic support.
Yes.
That was Whiteberg Clinic, where is my primary employer. That's what it was started with, was that idea of helping folks in the 60s who didn't have support around bad trips, essentially. So we're taking that experience that we have as practitioners in rock medicine, which we do like Zendo is going to Oregon Country Fair and concerts, and helping folks when they're having trouble with their, in an altered state.
Yes.
So yeah, if you're interested, you can check check it out. It's
Thank
really
you.
exciting.
Subtlewinds.com. Okay. Thank you.
Ken, I want to thank you for doing this presentation. I was a little bit concerned about what it would entail. In 1973, I had a near-death experience. Thankfully for me, it was very powerful and it was extremely beautiful for me. However, it was very confusing when I came back to the world, the world I knew. I was fortunate that I found Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, and I did realize I had done a life review, and I think from what had taken place, I was making a decision whether I would be staying or I would be leaving the world. And I had hemorrhaged, and I had an ectopic pregnancy. And when I returned to the operating room, the doctor was standing there and said, "We almost lost you." So the experience, being able to pull the threads together, took a long period of time for me to understand specifically what had happened. And it seems from what you share, the use of ayahuasca is a way to have an understanding pretty much soon after. Is that correct? Okay, so, and that there is support that's there for you. Yeah. I felt like alone. I mean, I knew internally that I was blessed, that I had spiritual beings that were guiding me and loving me and protecting me, and that didn't leave. I became highly psychic. And I think that's what led me to work with hospice and the dying, because I knew I was terrified of death before the experience, and afterward I knew it was just a transitional phase. I had that understanding, so I'm grateful.
Well, looking at your eyes and nodding at me a couple times during, I'm so grateful that you're willing to share why sort of there is an energy around you attending this. And I do sometimes, without ever having a near-death experience, hearing that and other people's experience, I think of it more as, ayahuasca can be a self-induced near-death experience if we just go by kind of the criteria, and with so much like, yes, this is what I'm going to do. It's sort of like preparing for skydiving or even a float tank. Things show up and we get scared all of a sudden. But if you've got the extra support around stepping in, even the example of Sue, like she wanted to quit after the first go round, right? And that could have been a wise decision for some people. It was the extra support she had on site and afterwards, I think was helpful. Thank you. Did you have a hard time giving language to people around you?
It took a while for me to fully comprehend everything that I experienced. I mean, it was being loved unconditionally, totally. It wasn't I had a person appear to me. It was just an energy and a huge ball of light that was within and around me, and that feeling of I was very well protected. But then I found myself, it's like when you're doing a blind survey, I was being asked questions, but not like you and I are speaking, but just mind to mind, and I was going yes, yes, no, yes. So I was kind of saying, have I met everything I came in this earth to do? And then, so the decision was to stay, and then I felt that hug, and then I felt the horrific pain of the surgery that they had cut me open in the abdomen, and I'm looking up at the operating light, and the doctor is standing there with me. So it was like going from such beauty and such ecstasy and unconditional love to this space of, now I'm back in this. It's like I was going down the water slides that they have in the parks, and it was all dark, so I'm going down this tunnel, and all of a sudden I wake up, and there's this operating room light, and me laying there and the doctor saying, "We almost lost you." So to integrate it was quite a period of time for me to understand.
Thank you very much. Julie?
Yes, my name's Julie. I'm a hospice chaplain, and I'm very interested in this area of research from a spiritual lens because so many people report that these are incredibly spiritual experiences for them. So I know that you're coming more from a therapy lens, but could you speak a little bit about helping people integrate the spiritual experiences that they may have?
And I think, yes, thank you for saying I'm coming from the therapeutic lens, because I try to talk that language as best I can, but I am residing in Oakland and I'm pretty hippy dippy. But I guess what comes to mind is really around for the spirituality part is that the key component of community integration circles that pop up in places, especially where these medicines are decriminalized, allow a freer form. No, I want to make sure I'm getting the question right.
So let me speak to places where that's not available.
Yes.
But people are still using these substances.
Yes.
So there's really no available framework necessarily because people are using them illegally, and yet they're still seeking out people that they want to talk to integrate these experiences.
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't know if you have experience with that.
In places where those integration circles aren't?
Correct.
Well, luckily, more and more of them are online. Now that's a challenge. Some people don't feel comfortable talking about their experiences online, right? But there are a lot of the centers that I'm naming that are in Berkeley or Marin, they have online support. Most of the psychedelic-assisted trainings, I've only attended 2 of them. Those were both online. They're in Utah. And so, again, there is ways to network through the wonderful interwebs. That's my first thought around that. But I think it is also about, because just like science has a hard time keeping up with reality, our field has a hard time keeping up with the needs. It is important for us to sort of be familiar with it, because I think even if it's a near-death experience or someone had something that's earth-shattering and challenges their current mind state, like taking psychedelics on their own, they need to have people kind of like safe spaces where people say, I'm familiar with this, let's talk about it. The difference between having someone that's having a really intense psychedelic experience and trying to give them like Xanax or something to bring them down, as opposed to just helping them move through it, the outcome is so hugely different. So just knowing where we can go and promoting that, I think, is key. I don't have all the lists of the centers that are doing integration circles, but I'm happy to provide that. My hunch will be long term that they're going to have some hybrid version of those. So does that get closer to your answer?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I gave you like a 2-part question.
No. I mean,
So I don't know if you have time to talk about integrating spiritual experiences.
I think it's really important for people to have their language around it. I slapped on the LCSW early in my life, but what people bring to the clinical space, I think, is above and beyond just talking about the head. One of the ways specifically that I integrate it is I have a room full of singing bowls, and we don't talk. The person lays down, and I serenade with them for 30, 40 minutes of our 75-minute session. And then they can talk about what their experience was. And it can be anything. There's only open acceptance of whatever that experience is. And I feel so honored that people can go somewhere, have their experience, and be willing to try and give language to it. That's one way that I, as a clinician, try to bring a place for above and beyond the transpersonal, the spiritual component to come in as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe one more question?
It seems to me too, just to jump off of that, is that it's really about a holistic approach.
Absolutely.
The spiritual aspect is not any separate really from the emotional or the
No.
mental or the physical.
Right.
So, I mean, that's how I would address it as a therapist. Not as something separate, but as like treating the whole person. Not treating, but just being with the whole person.
Yes. I mean, I I found as soon as I got done with social work, I felt lost because I couldn't find an orientation to work with. DBT came a little bit close to that. That's, wise mind. But once I found yoga, then I had something to work with. And a lot of the times we're not sitting together, we're moving together. And I think any holistic approach could invite more of the person to show up. But I like pushing up against the clinical box that we've created and say, there's got to be more space for the person. Angela, do you want to?
No, I say I like this.
Okay. May I do one more sharing and close? We've got room for one more question. Yeah? Okay. Yesterday was Earth Day. I would have loved to have presented this on Earth Day, but oh well. Every day is Earth Day, right? So after during the pandemic, I had a chance to sit with one of my teachers, and this was a little acrostic poem that I wrote afterwards. It's hard to write during. Earth Child. Eager to nurture and repair, ailing Gaia stands a chance. Relatively small yet determined me, through action, seeds are sowed. Heal thyself, naked toes touch. Courage it takes to not wither in despair. Hope is the sapling to honor. Instinct to listen more deeply. Love, learn, lean into the eternal romance. Devotion to earth, for she is all we have. Thank you all for letting me be part of your day.